And just a couple kind of housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar, so you will be able to watch it or refer it to a board member so they can watch it. So again, this is going to be recorded. Um, I have a lot of great content, mostly case studies of land trusts doing earned revenue strategies. And I'm going to conduct 2 interviews during the course of the webinar with 2 Massachusetts land trusts, and we'll take questions all the way at the end. So we're going to get through all the information. Just send your questions type them into the chat, or just hold them off to the end. So that's a little bit of the structure of today's session. So as Rob mentioned, Ole Amundsen, I live in southern Vermont, right on the Williamstown border. And I've been running a small consulting practice, largely focused on helping land trusts develop earned revenue strategies, doing organizational development and strategic planning work with land trusts. For part of the benefit of attending today's session is if you want to know more, or have a brainstorming session on how to incorporate earned revenue, I'm happy to offer you a complimentary 1-hour brainstorming session to kind of take these ideas and try to apply them to your organization.
Just a quick tech check, Ula. Are other people hearing an echo? So sounds like some people are not, but at least one person is. So I don't know if you okay. Hmm. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna play with some things, but carry on, Ula.
No problem, Rob. It wouldn't be a Zoom without some sort of little bug in there somewhere, but we, again, respond to the challenge. Um, First, I just want to start by thanking both Rob and Barbara for making this opportunity possible. It's not something the coalition does every day, so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this topic. I'd also like to thank the Land Trust Alliance for helping support my research in this area, because they've made that really, really possible. And then to the land trusts, for about the past 6 months, I've interviewed about 100 land trusts around the country, and I'll be sharing their stories. And they're willing to sort of share stories with you, the things that worked, the things that maybe didn't work out as well as I thought. And so I think that candid sharing is really how we all improve as a field. And I really appreciate their trust. So thanking all the land trusts that I interviewed as a basis of this work. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about, why diversifying revenue makes sense in this moment in time. And then we're going to hop right into a bunch of case studies. And these are case studies largely from around the country. I do have 2 from Massachusetts, but mostly case studies from other parts of the country. And the way I've structured the session is asking basically a series of questions that entrepreneurs need to answer when launching any kind of venture, and how that particular question is answered within the structure of the case study. Of course, this isn't linear. All these questions are interrelated. How you set your price depends on what the competition is or what your market is. So they're all interrelated and not a linear exercise. But for this format, this is how it's going to work. And again, we'll be doing 2 mini interviews of Massachusetts land trusts in their efforts, and we'll hold questions until the end. So that's a snapshot of our agenda. So it seems that basically every week, if you turn on the news, read your newspaper, wherever you get your news from, there's an article, a headline of a federal agency that is experiencing, budget cuts, staff layoffs, et cetera. So we all know those headlines, and that's the moment that we're in, is a significant retraction of federal funding. And when, the federal government has pneumonia, about a year later, all the states end up with colds and other sorts of ailments, and their budgets start to contract as they have to make up for the shortfall in a lot of these budget cuts. And you're starting to see that around the country where state budgets are also starting to retract. And nonprofits, when those 2 sources contract, they frequently then go to their favorite foundation or most loyal foundation. And foundations are seeing incredible upticks in applicants, and they're not able to meet all of that need. which is unfortunate. But that's the moment that we find ourselves in. And again, part of a strategy to help relieve that is to think about entrepreneurial approaches that are scalable for land trust to sort of try to create your own business model, which reduces some of that dependency long term on those different funding sources and also puts you a little bit more in control. And I want to kind of give a caveat. If you had a $25 million RCPP grant that you were counting on over 5 years and suddenly that was canceled last year, you're not going to be able to make up for that revenue shortfall by selling t-shirts. So I don't want to mislead you in saying that earned revenue strategies can completely replace multi-million dollar grants or that it can happen in a very short term. Many of these strategies require multiple years of commitment to continue with, et cetera. But it's important to sort of start diversifying your revenue now. And as Winston Churchill, put it in the dark days of World War II, gentlemen, we have run out of money and now we have to think. And so that is the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think we can think our way out of this situation. So, sources of revenue. We're going to spend most of our time talking about earned revenue. And I'm sure that's a phrase that's bandied around a bit, and maybe some are not aware of what that is. It's transaction-based revenue. You are literally doing a transaction with someone where you're giving them something and they are giving you money for that. And there are two types of earned revenue: mission-related, which is, as it sounds, the transaction is tax-free because the transaction is related directly to the mission of your land trust. So you don't pay taxes on that. Then there's unrelated business income, which you can still do that transaction, but you will pay taxes on that revenue. Important point, always when thinking about earned revenue, talk to your CPA, talk to your accountant, talk to your lawyer, vet your ideas on earned revenue before them to basically make a determination whether or not it's mission related or unrelated business income. The IRS, no surprise, has rules and regulations and criteria, much like the criteria for deciding whether or not a conservation restriction or easement is tax deductible. But those criteria are very vague. And when the IRS has vague criteria, that's when you really need to learn to turn to professional help of your CPAs and lawyers for interpreting that before venturing into that. All of the examples today we'll talk about are mission-related revenue streams. And I've encountered very few land trusts that are doing any unrelated business income. So again, just a point of the scale of this. Investment income. One thing that many land trusts who've been around for a long time, they have endowments and they take off a certain percentage of the earnings of their endowment every year as revenue. And that's a great strategy, and I encourage all land trusts to be working on building an endowment. It's a very solid approach, and it's going to get you through very difficult times when you have retractions or shortfalls in other funding sources. Like earned revenue, building an endowment doesn't happen overnight, and it takes decades of consistent work. Land Trust Alliance has a very good webinar on building endowments. I suggest looking at that resource. I will talk a little bit about endowments as a percentage of income for some of the case studies, just to sort of show you the size and scale of where that kind of plugs in. Traditional fundraising, where you're going off and basically doing annual appeals and solicitations, for donors. You're not basically providing something of value to them. They're just giving you money. We are not going to talk about traditional fundraising in that way. Obviously, encouraging all organizations to be very methodical about, courting their donors and being very strategic about that. Again, like any of these efforts, it's a multi-year effort that you have to be really committed to. I will, however, talk about events because how I view events as being an entrepreneurial idea that you're going out there and doing something. And that event then has a life of its own and can kind of build towards your organization. And some of these strategies are interrelated. For example, in my research, many land trusts are doing multi-day bike rides. where a rider is paying an entry fee. That entry fee is the earned revenue component. They are paying to be part of your bike ride. Then, if they do some fundraising, on the side with their friends, that they get, say, $1 per kilometer that they bike or $1 per mile, that is a traditional fundraising approach nested within the event. So that's an example of an event, but it has both an earned revenue component as well as a traditional fundraising component. So finally, grants. We're not going to touch a lot on grants. With the exception of in diversifying revenue, sometimes applying to sources of revenue that you haven't considered before or don't have a lot of experience in is where you should apply. 25 years ago, most people in the conservation community would have never thought the Department of Defense would be funding conservation, but they are a significant funder of conservation now. Correspondingly, I'm going to encourage many of you to look up your local economic development district. Economic development districts can be a source of project grants for doing things like building boardwalks, renovating buildings to be used as a headquarters, things like that, infrastructure projects. So again, part of diversifying revenue is to apply to different federal agencies and different levels of government that you haven't done before. And I think economic development agencies have been undersubscribed from the land trust movement. So in diversifying revenue, you have all these different sources. And one thing to consider is it's not just about the money. With every different source, you have a relationship. And the more sources of revenue you have, I would argue the deeper and more meaningful relationship you have with community and the broader sense of community that you might have. So if you have funding from just one or two sources, not only are you financially, more vulnerable, but you also don't have as many opportunities or as many relationships there. And so that's a sign and it's a proxy. So again, diversifying revenue, good financial strategy, but also a good way and a good proxy for the health of your organization and the depth and scale of its relationships with its community. So, stepping back, one of the larger points of this whole conversation is that, land trusts, like all organizations, have like an arc of development with a beginning, middle, and sometimes an end, and different stages along that. It's no secret that land trust started out with a lot of enthusiasm, usually formed around a crisis project. Bob Smith's farm is going on the market. We have 30 days to raise the money. And so a group of committed citizens comes together, they raise the money, and they say, wow, that was great. Let's form a land trust. And that's kind of a very familiar story. And they get incorporated and they do a couple more projects and things move along. You hit your stride there, number two, and maybe hire some staff and kind of keep moving along. Eventually, at some point, all the easy deals are kind of done. And what we're seeing nationally is deal flow is starting to slow. And part of that is we are victims of our own success. We've been at this acquisition game for, in some places, about 50 years. And so there are just fewer deals to be done. If 30 by 30 comes true, what are we going to do that January of 3031 in terms of, if there are fewer deals? We need to start planning now for the transition when the energy behind land trusts moves from being largely acquisition-based organizations into stewardship organizations. Because again, as I said earlier, a lot of these revenue sources are going to take some time. They need a long runway to build up a head of steam. So if you're thinking, and I think eventually in a lot of places, this is going to come sooner rather than later. So it's never too soon to start. And using this opportunity of this federal funding crisis is an opportunity to kind of reinvent yourself. So that little dotted line over there is we want to reinvent land trust to basically be more diverse than just acquisition, agencies. And it's not that acquisition is a bad thing, but I think having a diverse pitch and offering a series of services makes sense, and you can bring in some revenue as part of that reinvention process. So, and I got this idea actually from Mary Kay, the Land Trust Alliance Midwest office, and she was talking about this about 12 years ago. And again, great ideas, and we're seeing, this moving ahead. All right, so where does this all begin? It starts with an idea. Um, these entrepreneurial impulses usually start from a board member or a staff member that has a new way of looking at something, a new way of doing something different. Lancaster Conservancy in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is a very mature land trust. It was actually founded by a group of anglers, hunters, and naturalists, which got together to conserve land around the Susquehanna watershed, and it was founded in 1969. They have about 51 preserves and about 8,000 acres held in fee, of which 6,000 acres is open for hunting. That's a key issue for them. Um, 72 conservation easements, totaling about 900 acres held under easements. And they have an operating budget of $3.4 million. And about 8% of their revenue is from actually providing programming. Over time, what they've observed is that it's getting harder and harder to basically subdivide out structures from parcels that they're thinking about acquiring. It used to be, 20 years ago, that you'd get a parcel and it'd have a house along a road, and you subdivide out the house and do the rest in some sort of easement or preserve. And increasingly, that's becoming more difficult. And so the executive director was kind of faced with a choice. And they also started thinking about the future value of these homes. And real estate is only appreciating in value, and maybe holding on to some of those homes, and structures made a lot of sense, even for things that they don't necessarily needs that they don't necessarily know that they have, but they want to sort of hedge their bets. So, the idea is that they needed to basically start to develop their property management muscle, which I think is just a great idea, and hold on to properties and start thinking about having those properties as basically being revenue generation potential. So again, the old model was kind of subdivide and get rid of the house that way, but the new model is at least taking a beat and thinking about it and assessing it. And they have a whole process for evaluating parcels. They've got a very good GIS system with conservation priorities for ranking properties. They have three different boards. They all go off and tour, the lands, and then evaluate whether or not the structure is something that they want to hold on to and can make some revenue. Long term, they're aiming to hold on to about 25 structures and do a series of rental and lease agreements. And their rentals include, renting to other nonprofits to use as office space, renting to staff for staff housing. They even have an Airbnb. And again, their tip was do not be the Airbnb operator. So find an Airbnb operator, because if you get calls at 3 in the morning that the hot water isn't working, those are your calls, and your staff will get rapidly burned out. So have that be someone else's call. So again, they do have an Airbnb, and their goal long term is to again have about 25 structures that they're holding on to for generating revenue, and their goal is to generate about a net of $40,000 per year, on that, which is again a different strategy. In my consulting work, this is actually where I'm seeing a pretty significant series of inquiries and uptick in work with people that are no longer just getting those bequests of houses and automatically selling those. They're wanting to take a beat and say, hey, does this make sense for some of these other types of uses? And that is starting to happen quite a bit. So I think it's a meaningful trend in a lot of different places. So as consultants, or as entrepreneurs, you have to figure out what you're selling and what your price is for that. And I will say land trusts struggle with this issue mightily. When we are selling our services, we're selling something, we have a hard time putting a price on it. And that I think is just true. And I'm going to show you two examples around that pricing structure. But you have to come up with a price, and that needs to reflect all the hard work, all the materials that you're going that puts into this product that you're selling or service, and you want to not you want to at least break even, if not make some money. That's the point of some of this exercise, is to bring in revenue. So that means you have to be charging a rate where you're actually going to be covering your costs and then some. So figuring that out is something that we're going to explore a little bit. Also in Pennsylvania is the Natural Lands Trust, and they've been around since 1953. They were one of the original land trusts that Kingsbury Brown interviewed when he was touring the country for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and those interviews formed the basis of forming the Land Trust Alliance. So they are one of the original kind of sentinel land trusts in our community. They service about 13 counties in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and they have 43 preserves in fee. They historically have had a very robust earned revenue shop. They have about 5 staff who just do consulting work for municipalities and private landowners. They write comprehensive plans. They develop zoning ordinances. They do development plans for developers. They do landscape plans for landowners and municipalities, and they are selling these services on the open market and making money doing that. About 8% of their entire revenue comes from earned revenue sources. And as you can see on the chart here, they do have a very healthy endowment, which is about a quarter of the revenue in any given year. And the rest is from donations and from government grants. Um, they actually entered the easement monitoring field. And this is an opportunity that might be out there for Massachusetts land trusts, as far as monitoring easements. You also have CPA communities that might also need that help too in monitoring conservation, easements as well. So that's a potential. In this case, they had one town that had 66 easements, and they agreed to monitor those and charge them a flat fee of $200 per easement. Um, and that turned out not to be enough. It was not enough to sort of make up for the staff time in doing that. And after a year or two of doing that, they had to renegotiate with the town to basically increase their fee. And when they did, the town decided to do the monitoring in-house. So this shows you a couple different things. One is you really do have to do your homework on what you're charging, and to make up for your labor that you're putting in, and you also kind of want to make some money on the side. Also, some clients are going to be sensitive to a price, and that's true. And so sometimes you can price yourself out of a market, but sometimes that price signal is also telling you that that might be a market that you don't want to be in if you cannot make up money in doing it. Going further down the coast to the coastal North Carolina, land trust, they were founded in 1992, and they serve 31 counties in the coastal plain of North Carolina, and they have about an $11 million operating budget, and they've conserved over 90,000 acres. Um, they have a very good, situation going with the state of North Carolina, where they negotiate conservation easements using state funds for the acquisition, and then, with the easement being assigned to the state, and then they are contracted by the state to do the monitoring of all the state easements. And they charge about $1,000 to $1,500 per easement. So a different price. They really did their homework on how much it costs to actually do this work. And they're still offering the state, I think, a pretty good rate. They are very cognizant of when they do their own monitoring and their state monitoring to sort of bundle trips, so they pass along those cost savings that way. And they earn between $25,000 to $30,000 a year as far as their profit margin on this contract. Now, that's no one is making millions of dollars monitoring easements, but that 25 or $30,000 a year is enough to take someone from part-time status to full-time status, which I think is really great for the organization, making it more resilient, more robust to have full-time staff than part-time staff. And so again, that's where kind of earned revenue can make that difference and increase your capacity by just enough to really take people from part-time to full-time work. Another question in this series of questions is entrepreneurs is what your market is. And who are you marketing this towards? So obviously, we talked about easement monitoring. Smaller land trusts might have needs in easement monitoring. Towns might have needs. So that's a way of identifying who your market is. um, the Kitsu Land Trust is located in northern Idaho, and they have been around since 2002. And they have about 400 acres conserved in fee and about 6,000 acres conserved with easements. And their operating budget is $1.1 million. And about 25% of their revenue every year comes from grants, 48% from individual donors, and then 22% from earned revenue. Um, and then 5% from business donations. And they're in a very rural area. The county that they serve only has 50,000 people. And, over the course of a couple of years, you will probably get to know every single one of those 50,000 people. So using traditional fundraising techniques, they can't grow their way out of their revenue by just doing strictly fundraising, because everyone knows who they are and they're probably pretty comfortable with their giving level. So if they need more revenue to achieve their mission, they have to go to other sources to do that and change that number. So to develop other relationships beyond those 50,000 people who live in that area or come in as winter or summer part-time residents. So earned revenue is a conscious strategy for them to diversify based on being in a small population area. So several years ago, they acquired about 180 acre parcel, to serve as a community forest. And about a year later, there was a significant wind event which blew down a ton of trees. And they have a forest management committee, and a commercial logging company which sits on that committee was perfectly willing to come in and kind of help them take some of the trees, but they wouldn't take the pine trees, which didn't have any commercial value. And that made up about 40% of the blowdown trees. So they went and got a grant and purchased a mini mill for $12,000 and started milling their own lumber and selling that. In fact, there's one architect in this town who's building his entire house using lumber milled, at the land trust mill. Um, and they're earning revenue of between $8,000 to $20,000 a year off of just the timber that's harvested, from this property. So that's a kind of a good, nice little cyclical kind of win-win. And again, they do have a management committee and a management plan so that they are tracking that they're doing responsible, harvesting. Um, Shortly thereafter, the executive director noticed that a local nursery was going to be for sale. And so they decided to actually purchase this nursery. And they purchased this nursery to serve as their headquarters because they were renting and they were at kind of bulging at the seams. So they needed a new office space. And they also thought that the nursery business would be a good way to sort of talk to local homeowners and make conservation something that they could do in their backyards. And so this nursery sells both native as well as non-native plants, but really emphasizes environmental education and what you can do about the pollinator crisis that we're all facing. So they've purchased this nursery. It's now their headquarters. They spent about $50,000 renovating the structure to serve as their headquarters. And they also now have a log yard for their timber operation. So you can go to your nursery, pick up your plants, and buy some 2x4s all at the same time. And this all benefits the land trust. It'll be an interesting question, how this succeeds, because they literally just opened their doors to the nursery in April of this year. So it's a pretty exciting stage for them. But again, these commercial enterprises, were their effort to again try to expand revenue sources beyond traditional sources. One thing that I hope that the series of case studies does is that I want land trusts to adjust their palate so they recognize when an opportunity kind of crosses their transom that makes sense in a multi-attribute way. In this particular case, Land Trust needed a headquarters. They were also looking for revenue, and it also had environmental education, and they're looking for a log yard for their things. So there's four things that this one parcel and venture could achieve as part of an acquisition. And in the course of your land trust existence, I'm sure you too will run upon some of these opportunities that don't come around every day, but you have to be able to recognize them. And hopefully, through this training, you'll be able to sort of recognize opportunities that are going to come your way to take best advantage of it in an entrepreneurial spirit. So, one thing I have talked about a little bit is, these ideas do take time to come to fruition. And they sometimes will start small and in terms of revenue numbers, but build over time. And a great example is right here in the Commonwealth, your good old Franklin Land Trust. And the Franklin Land Trust was founded in 1987 and serves one county in Massachusetts. They have a $1.1 million operating budget, and they own 1,300 acres of land in fee, and they have 170 easements covering about 13,000 acres. And back in 2005, a volunteer who was very interested in riding the gravel roads of the area came up with an idea to do a gravel bike ride and grabbed about 30 of his friends, and they rode in a day 180 kilometers, which is astonishing to me. And they raised a little money, about $600, and gave it to the ED. And that was the beginning of this incredible event, which now is a major event and brings in about 1,500 riders from all over the country that come to ride varying in distances. They have 8 different rides covering different distances all over the county. Come camp out overnight and have this great experience. And many of the riders do actually become, members of the organization. So it's had a lot of good upsides. One little kind of note is if in the photo in the lower corner there, you see a little sign, and the Land Trust basically puts up signs on all the areas that they've conserved in fee or an easement so that, again, riders become educated that this beautiful landscape that they are seeing is not an accident. Someone is actually out there conserving, this property, and that was meaningful. And I think that's really powerful. Anytime you have an event like this, or an entrepreneurial effort, thinking of ways where you can directly connect the mission of your organization to the event. And I think Mary's done a fabulous job of connecting the mission to the event, with the signage. And now I'm going to talk to Mary, and she's have a couple questions for her. So, Mary, tell me about the D2 R2 ride and how it evolved from a fundraising idea and into a community event that advances the Land Trust's broader mission and visibility.
Well, I think starting off small was an important point here, right? 35 riders and $600 that first year. We're on target for about 1,700 riders this year, and it brings in about 1/6 of our annual budget. And I think that what was important is that we found a way to connect the riders emotionally to the land here. And that is through, with a signage, with talking about specific segments of the routes that were particularly gnarly or interesting to them, and connecting them directly to the landscape. I literally have had dozens of riders move here to Franklin County from all over the country, as far away as Washington State. I was in contact last year with one of the riders because they participated in D2R2 and fell in love with this landscape. And it's not only the riders who have a greater understanding, but as you can imagine, putting on an event this large, we've had to connect with town officials and local businesses and the community at large about this event over the year. We're on our 21st year doing this, and that's helped them connect D2R2, which is an easy concept for them, an event concept, to the Franklin Land Trust and the work of the Land Trust. So I think that that shift in the riders and the community's understanding of the work that we did makes it much more meaningful and not just like transactional. Let's buy a piece of art and now that we're done and we're not talking to the Land Trust anymore. So it's been
Great.
huge.
So, what strategies do you think have been most effective in turning event participants into these kind of long-term supporters, members, and advocates?
I think you hit it on the head when you talked about our signage. You know, of the 8 different routes we have, each of the riders pass between 20 and 40 of our conserved lands or our fee-owned lands on one route. And so that's that direct connection. But then understanding that the event is just a single touch point, right? It's the first time that we're meeting with these riders, but we need to continue that story with them. And so consistent storytelling throughout the year, helping the participants understand that whether it was just their registration fee or if they bought a t-shirt at the event or whatever it was, it's having an impact on this landscape and converts them into donors because they understand the mission more and they become more engaged.
Great. And then, what lessons from this ride would you share with other land trusts that are considering kind of a signature event?
I think the most important lesson is to start small and to grow it organically, not to focus on a rapid expansion of the event, but really more heavily on the participant experience, the volunteer culture. We have 170 volunteers every year that we couldn't put on the event without. And so building up that and the community at large, you know, the folks that come out and offer popsicles to the riders or have the kids ring the bells as the riders go by. I think that that building it small, building up that sort of base is going to create the sustainability in the event.
Right. One final surprise question. You know, having looked at your registration, I noticed you have a really good online merchandise, store, which I was really you can get Franklin Land Trust bike shorts, which I'm dying to try out. Can you tell us a
You
little
need
bit
to do
about
that.
the evolution of the online store? And you mentioned, that sometimes the sales on that take place at a different time than you might think.
Right. So we have during registration online, of course, you can purchase the t-shirt from the event or the jersey from the event. But then we have an online store as well that we found has been very successful between after the event, because of course our merchandise is for sale at the event, but from after the event until the holidays, because a lot of times the riders will leave and they didn't get a t-shirt and they're regretting that, and so their partner or whatever will purchase that for them, or they'll purchase that for them in time for the holidays. And so we have a fairly robust store that goes from August to December-ish, slows down again in the spring, and then goes, ramps up again as we get closer to the ride. I see Colin's question there. I don't know if you want me to answer it. We actually don't use a vendor. So for the event itself, we use Bike Reg for registration and merchandise sales. But online, we just have an online store that our web developer purchased. So we ship the things right from here. We've built in the shipping, we've built in the inventory, and we do it right through our website, Colin.
So that's great. And I just want to thank Mary for making time available today, for sharing her thoughts, on this great event. I'm on the fence on registering for this year, but yes, I think I can do the Green River portion of it.
You
Not
got
that,
it.
which is not 180 kilometers, but there is a ride out there for you. So I encourage everyone to register. For the event. It's at towards the end of August, and I think it'll be a great gathering in terms of conservation. So thank you, Mary, for sharing your experience. Okay. So in answering questions, we've talked about price, we've talked about what your market is. Assessing who your competition is important because again, your competition will also have an influence on what price you can charge and their percentage that they occupy in the market. So using Mary's example, if there were 14 gravel bike rides in Franklin County, probably adding a 15th would be kind of not the best, idea in terms of if you're hoping to generate revenue. So again, just kind of taking that, and again, trying to expand on that idea. So, when they started, this was probably the only gravel bike ride in the area. And so that is, certainly kind of helpful. And now it is a very big event. And again, I think that is, the gravel bike ride is the show to beat in the area in terms of the events. But you need to think about who your competition is when you think about your entrepreneurial idea. So the Montauk Preserve over the border in New York State, um, you know, that organization was basically founded in 1963, and it's an interesting story. It was actually originally a 20,000 acre block of land owned by the Smiley family. And for those of you who know conservation, yes, we're talking about Mark Smiley's family, the noted conservationist and strategic planner from the Pacific Northwest. His great 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 grandparents, were involved in this, and they had a resort. And so it was three brothers, and they decided to sort of peel off 8,000 acres in 1963 and devote that to conservation. And this is basically the entire ridge front known as the Gunks. And it's probably one of the top three rock climbing destinations in the country. Many world-class rock climbers gotten their start climbing in the Gunks. And you talk to anyone in the climbing community, it is a big deal. And they basically control about 80% of all of the climbing surfaces in the Gunks. So again, they were founded in 1963. They have about 8,000 acres. They have about a $5 million operating budget, 30 full-time staff. About 25% of their revenue comes from earned revenue, only about 5% from grants, and about 9% from investments and from an endowment. And they charge admission. And so they charge admission for just entering the preserve to hike or walk, and that's one level. Or they charge a different admission for if you want to do cross-country skiing, horseback riding, bike riding, or rock climbing. And so there are two different admission rates for kind of day passes. If you join as a member, then you don't have to pay admission. So they have been one of my clients, and I've been working with them on resetting their pricing structure for both their day passes as well as their membership. And they hadn't changed the prices for 8 years. And there's this little thing called inflation, which has been chipping away at these things. And so they needed to kind of redo their structure in terms of charging admission for day passes and for membership. So I was able to help them out, with that. It was a really fascinating organization to work with. It's being run by Kevin Case, who many of you will recognize. He's the former LTA Northeast director and just a great guy to work with. And now he's the president of this organization. Now, one little caveat: when you charge admission, that can, depending on your state liability rules, put you liable for things that can happen to those visitors. So say you charge admission, visitor falls and breaks their ankle, they could hold you liable potentially due to state rules because you charge an admission fee. So you need to look at your state rules in terms of how admissions and it affects your insurance levels, things like that. In Massachusetts, some organizations charge a parking fee. So, for example, if you go to Cranes Beach, which is managed by the trustees of reservations, you're not paying an admission fee, you are paying a parking fee. So sometimes by changing that, you can also change your admission. But again, this is one of those times where you have to talk to your lawyer about that. So again, but again, just an interesting idea. Again, we conserve these special places, and so charging people admission is again one way of kind of raising revenue about that. In the competition scale, they are surrounded by two other landowners who also can charge admission. In blue is the state forest, and they charge an admission of $10 per carload. So for $10, you can be driving in a minivan with 20 of your friends and get a pretty good discounted experience. In green is the Montauk, Preserve. And again, they were charging, admission of $15 for individuals for hiking and $20 per individuals for climbing. And then you have the Montauk Preserve, which is that icon in the white inholding there, right above the Montauk Preserve, and that's the original. That's the resort, and they charge $35 admission just for going in to their preserve. So when you're thinking about your pricing structure, here you have three landowners. Everyone is charging an admission rate. And so when we were thinking about redoing the emissions, we had to stay like more expensive than 10 and less than 35, because that definitely influences where people go. And again, Kevin does a great job. They do have all sorts of ways of offering discounts to local residents, and also to people who can't afford the admission. So they do have a social equity component, which is pretty thought out. But again, in thinking about your competition, this was just a great example of competition and how we had to sort of go and kind of shape our pricing, not only based on the kind of the product we're providing, but what others are charging. So in all these different, ventures, sometimes you can't do it alone, and sometimes your venture can benefit from a creative partnership. And that brings us over to Mount Grace, which was founded in 1986, and they own around 2,300 acres of land in fee and close to 7,000 acres as conservation, restrictions. And they serve about 23 towns in central and western Massachusetts, and they have a budget of a little over $2 million. And several years ago, they started a outdoor concert series in partnership with a local brewery that has an outdoor concert, venue. And so the brewery is actually hosting the concert and running the show, and yet doing it on behalf of the land trust. So this is an example of a partnership where the land trust, is basically comes and sets up a table and can sell merchandise, and the event is advertised as kind of a co-production, but yet they're not responsible for actually the venue, or a lot of the kind of logistics around that. And at the end of the concert, the brewery gives them a check. Land Trust has also been successful in bringing in sponsorships for the event, as well in terms of revenue. This year, the event will take place on September 12th. So again, get your tickets now. Should be fun. And I have James Combs. Are you on the line?
Yes. Hi.
Great, James. Thanks for making the time to be here and share your stories about this event. What has been the biggest surprise in launching this event and making it an annual event?
Well, a couple of surprises, certainly, but the first being that the first year we did this concert, our board member who owns Carter and Stevens Farm in Stone Cow told us about a month before the event that we were doing a concert. So that was a fun surprise, and we sort of rallied together pretty quick to build the stage that you can see in that picture, which finished the day before the concert. But initially, we thought that this concert was going to be a big, individual fundraiser and membership booster event. But it sort of transitioned to being a really strong fundraising event for us, and an even stronger business sponsorship, sort of onboarding event. We've used it to reach out to some bigger local businesses that we haven't had opportunities to really reach out to in the past. So that's been pretty cool.
Great. And how do you include the land trust message and mission in your event so it's impactful?
Um, 4 years ago, we protected just over 600 or so acres at Stone Cow Farm. So that's a pretty pretty easy one for us, I think. We pop up on the stage in between some of the asks and let people know that you're hanging out on protected land, that we have other projects in the area that are going on. Like you mentioned, we have a table set up so we get to talk to everyone who comes through the event. And it's been really nice to be able to actually connect with people on the land in that way. We try to do a lot of our events on protected land, but this one is particularly special because of the history of Stone Cow and especially the history of Stone Cow with Mount Grace.
Great. That's fantastic. With the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently knowing what you know now?
I think you mentioned it a few times, but these types of events take a long time to get rolling. And when we first found out we were doing this event, we really tried to put a lot on our, maybe too much on our plates, and tried to tackle too many things. And so the first year was a huge success. The second year slowed down a little bit as we tried to really readjust our bearings and figure out what we wanted from the event now that we had some more time to plan it. Um, so the other factor in it is festivals like this, bigger bands that'll bring in a wider range of people aren't necessarily going to want to play a new festival. So now that we're 4 years in, we have a bigger name, which we will announce soon, uh, playing this year, which is pretty exciting. And of course, the bigger names come with bigger costs and potentially bigger sponsorships, which is great. So I guess if there was something we would do differently is to maybe slow down a little bit. Another thing I found interesting was that this particular event, uh, our demographic around here skews on the older side, and this particular event brings in a number of younger people who aren't necessarily ready to start their monthly membership or, make a large, philanthropic gift. So it's been a really cool onboarding platform for volunteers as well, and to get younger people who we wouldn't really be able to reach out to in any other way engaged with our programs. So that's been a very cool process to see.
James, thank you for sharing your wonderful stories. Good luck with the planning. Looking forward to the big announcement.
Thank you.
So one thing I also thought about with this event is, there are a lot of land trusts which don't have may not have any fee lands that just have conservation restrictions. And when you don't have any fee lands, you do have reduced opportunities for kind of earned revenues, but it's not zero. And you through partnership, you can do events at other people's venues, and that is certainly kind of part of the spirit here is again around that problem solving. So with events, you don't have to own it to sort of have a meaningful event that engages people and brings in some revenue. So as I talked about, I would encourage, as far as diversifying funding, conservation groups to look at economic development agencies as a source of funding, particularly a source of funding to transition between being land acquisition organizations into stewardship organizations. So, if you need infrastructure to sort of support that transition, so let's say, you needed to build a wetland boardwalk. An economic development agency might be willing to fund some of that because it will become a regional attraction. So think about that as kind of a funding source for that type of infrastructure. And I'm going to have an article coming out in Saving Land in the fall called Economic Development Funding 101 for Land Trusts. So this is a little sneak peek, but economic development in this country is run through the Economic Development Agency, which is part of the Department of Commerce. And then they basically have a series of they're not field offices, but they kind of are. They're called economic development districts, and they're about 400 scattered throughout the country. And these are application-based organizations. In other words, you don't automatically have an economic development district. You have to actually apply for one. So interestingly enough, the Berkshires didn't have an economic development agency until 2022, which is just astonishing to me. But they hadn't applied. And when you apply, and in Massachusetts, most of the economic development districts sit within a regional planning agency or council of governments. And what happens is by being declared an economic development district, you get an annual check. I think it's up to about $90,000 per year, which basically funds an economic development professional in your organization. And so this is a list of all the on the right there, a list of all the EDDs in Maine, in Massachusetts. And so this professional, part of their responsibility is to coordinate what's known as the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or CEDS plan. And this is a 5-year plan, and it looks at that particular geography. So, for example, we'll take the Berkshires. Takes a look at the Berkshires and identifies strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. So a SWOT analysis looks at all the big employers, what workforce planning is going on, all this sort of stuff, what the big trends are economically in your jurisdiction. And it has a project list at the end. And so these are traditionally infrastructure projects. And it is kind of like the first hurdle to get funding from the Economic Development Agency is to have your project, again, we'll take the Wetland Boardwalk, listed as an approved project in your CEDS plan. So, the first step for land trusts is to go out and find if your land trust has an EDD operating in your service territory, make a meeting, go out for coffee, and meet with your economic development professional. Ask them about their CEDS planning process, where it is. Find out who is an official member of the CEDS committee. And the example I have here is from the Berkshires, and these are all the members of the Berkshire CEDS committee. When I asked the ED why there wasn't a land trust, she said, well, you know what? I just never thought about it. Because the Berkshires has lots of very savvy land trusts. And I think that is kind of part of the barrier, is many people in the economic development field also don't think of land trusts as land trusts don't think of themselves as participating in economic development. So try to participate in the CEDS planning process and ask them about how to nominate, projects. And if you do have an infrastructure like project, see if they'd be interested in potentially listing it in the CEDS plan. Also, land trusts are employers very often. And so you are an employer just like anyone else. So you have a seat at the table and you've got unique insight. Many of these plans are focused on increasing tourism, about preserving quality of life as a way of attracting employers. And they turn to land trusts as the experts in these fields. And so you do have expertise that will be welcomed. So again, in diversifying funding, think about places you haven't gone to before. And I would argue that economic development has been a place that the land trust community has not traditionally applied for funding at, and we can do a little bit more in this effort. So again, that's a tip for the day. So now we have all these ideas. What are we going to do with it? So we're gonna take a trip to West Virginia, and this is my last kind of case study. And the Capon Lost Rivers Land Trust in West Virginia was founded in 1990, and they are an easement-only land trust, and they hold about 15,000 acres worth of easements in remote West Virginia, and that constitutes about close to 60 easements. They have an operating budget of $350,000 and a staff of 2. And they're thinking about this moment when they're going to be going from acquisition to largely stewardship. And they're including it in their strategic plan and putting dates around it. So they're looking out to 2030, 2035, and thinking that deal flow is going to slow to an extent where they can no longer rely on that solely to bring in donations to sort of make the land trust viable. They need to start thinking now about programming and about other ways of relating to the community beyond acquisition, and they've put it into their plan. So this is copied right out of their plan in terms of, thinking about this. So that is one step that you can take, is start thinking about this transition, when it's going to happen, and putting it into your strategic plan. Again, as I talked about, at the beginning, I'm happy to brainstorm with any of you, for an hour, and think about, your land trust, and, and thinking about, where you can do earned revenue, thinking about what you own, what your assets are, whether it's fee lands. A lot of land trusts will have artwork hanging on their walls and other sorts of assets, which other organizations don't necessarily have. And it's about thinking about that asset list and what you can do with that. What skills or activities are marketable? So, for example, you have easement monitoring skills, you have land acquisition skills. There are some land trusts which again contract out their land acquisition staff to CPA communities to do deals on behalf of the municipality that doesn't have the money to bring on a full-time acquisition person. What's unique about your region? Because what's unique about your region is something that you can package and sort of sell in some fashion to the outside world. And I think both examples from Massachusetts are basically selling a unique experience about rural Massachusetts. And you can't get that in some other geographies. So thinking about your region that way. So those are some thoughts, as to next steps. And again, what I found is oftentimes the barriers to adopting new ideas is having that first meeting. So do reach out, and we can have that first meeting and get going on your strategies for earned revenue. Again, thank you, Rob and Barbara, for your time and making this opportunity available. And now is question time.
Yeah, let me just say we are at time, but if you have a couple minutes, Ula, maybe there's time for a couple questions. We'll
Yep.
send a follow-up note to folks with Ula's contact information for you to follow up and
In the presentation.
and a presentation. If Ula's willing to share the slides, we'll do that as well. So there was one note in the chat there about interesting question as to it related to the rental properties in Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
And I assume that is unrelated business income, right? If you're doing
Right.
Airbnb, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And probably the deeper question was about, well, is $40,000 worth the effort? And I guess, it goes to a broader question about how when you're embarking on this, particularly when you haven't done it yet, how does one think about what a reasonable return is to make it worth embarking or taking the chance to embark on it?
Yes, no, I too had that thought when I heard that number, for 20 properties, and thought, that seems a little low, for that. And I think this all gets down to the pricing. I think land trusts, when they price a product, you know, give kind of automatic discounts. So a lot of their renters are other nonprofit organizations. So they're not charging them like the highest rate that they possibly could, and they're kind of willing to sort of take a little bit less in that way. But I think the question is correct in the sense of you do have to think about what a return on investment is in terms of, is the juice worth the squeeze? And I think in some cases you're right, these revenue efforts might be more modest than your need and may not be scalable to a level that you are actually going to sort of earn a sufficient amount in relationship. And that's kind of just a judgment call to your individual kind of budget situation. As I talked about with the easement case, I think for the coastal North Carolina, thing, it did make a difference in taking someone who was part-time and making them full-time. And I think in that case, it made sense. And in other cases, it may not make sense.
Yeah, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions they want to raise before we wrap up? All right. Well, in that case, we'll thanks again to Ula, and we'll be sending an email with some follow-up. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody. Take care.